At the beginning of the 20th century, a mysterious historical figure appeared in Russia, a man named Rasputin, a monk who became famous among people for using spiritual abilities to heal the sick, and also for having visions that let him predict the future. At that time, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas Romanov II, and this is a picture of him with his family, who were the last royal family to rule Russia. Prince Alexei, the Tsar's son, was sick with a serious disease, and his health was at its worst. His mother, Tsarina Alexandra, heard about Rasputin, and sure enough, Rasputin was brought to the royal palace. He placed his hand on the head of the sick Prince Alexei, and suddenly they found that the prince started to heal and improve. This incident made Rasputin's status incredibly high in the eyes of Tsar Nicholas and his wife Tsarina Alexandra, and he became very close to them. Rasputin is considered one of the most historically fascinating figures, with so many stories and legends surrounding him. A truly puzzling, mysterious, and intriguing character. I mean, imagine, dozens of books were written about him, and he appeared in dozens of movies and TV shows, and there's even a famous song about him. So how did a man like Rasputin, coming from the peasant class, from a tiny village, manage to reach the ruling family and manipulate them? This strange story is actually made up of two parts: the story of Rasputin and the story of the Tsar's ruling family in Russia. The two parts start separately and then they meet at a certain point. This video is a historical story, and it's the powerful and very gripping kind. So let's get into it. In a small village located in the Siberia region of Russia, Grigori Rasputin was born on January 20th, 1869. This Siberian region where he was born is considered one of the most remote areas in Russia. So from a young age, Rasputin lived a tough life. His father was a simple peasant, barely getting by, and his mother gave birth to 7 children before him, but they all died in childhood except Rasputin. Some of them died during birth, some died as infants or at a very young age, and when Rasputin reached his early teenage years, his mother died in a fire and his father died from illness. So literally, he had nobody left in this world. The boy started to lose his way. He started stealing just to eat and survive, and he started drinking to forget his troubles and the hardships of life. And then he started getting into trouble, being immoral, and getting into messed up relationships. So this reputation spread about him that he was a thief, a drunk, and immoral. The complete package. Rasputin grew up, and in his mid-20s he found himself a wife, and by the time he reached 28 he had 4 children with her. And even though he'd become, a family man with responsibilities, he was still a thief, a drunk, and immoral. He didn't drop any of his old habits. He was even cheating on his wife, and his wife knew about it, but she stayed holding on to him. I don't know how he messed with her head to that degree. She just wasn't willing to let go of him no matter what happened. Anyway, one day Rasputin stole a horse, and a horse back then was a big deal. So the owners of the horse kept chasing him until they knocked him off the horse and caught him. The village people beat him up badly, and in the end he begged them to forgive him. Their condition was that he had to leave the village, so he was forced to leave the village and abandoned his children and wife. After a period of wandering and living in the wilderness, he decided to seek refuge in the church. The church's bishops and priests managed to draw him in and convince him to turn to God and to religion. So Rasputin entered the atmosphere of the church and worship and started learning religious teachings according to the Orthodox Church way. He got deeper and deeper into these matters until he was basically considered a monk. And then after a while, word started spreading that he had spiritual abilities. Most likely he's the one who spread this about himself. These spiritual abilities were supposedly about treating and healing the sick. So he'd go to sick people and perform rituals on them and read incantations over them. And the strange thing is that many of these people actually got better. So word started spreading about him that this was a blessed monk who heals people. The explanation many historians and researchers have for this phenomenon and Rasputin's strange ability to heal people is that he was actually treating them psychologically. Nobody back then cared much about the psychological side of things. Issues like stress, pessimism, anxiety, and depression didn't have therapists or specialists in those times. He was playing on that exact string. He had social and emotional intelligence and knew how to talk to people and how to deal with them. It's that type of intelligence you find in con artists. He knew how to reassure people and knew how to make them feel better. This was how he marketed himself. And imagine, Rasputin found himself a religious sect. They called themselves, and this was a sect affiliated with the Orthodox Church, meaning they considered themselves part of the church. Members of this sect would, normally go to church and practice the same regular worship rituals. But at night, they'd hold isolated gatherings among the trees and forests. They'd gather in a hut or even in an open space and sit there performing their own special rituals, dancing wildly in a crazy way, beating themselves and doing strange movements and things. And after these rituals, pardon me for saying this, they'd have a group debauchery party. Why? Because that was their way of getting closer to God. Their sect's teachings said that the greatest way to get closer to God is through sin. The more sins you committed, the greater your repentance would be. So the idea was they'd commit major sins and then repent. Really strange stuff. So when Rasputin got introduced to this sect, he was thrilled. He was like, wow, your religion is nice, immorality and getting closer to God at the same time? Best sect a drunken, immoral person like him could ever find. So Rasputin dove deep into this vibe of being, immoral, but at the same time a monk and a man of religion. He basically started creating his own personal religion, and he kept going on this pilgrimage journey of his, moving from city to city, and his reputation as a blessed monk kept spreading everywhere across Russia. At this same time, while Rasputin was wandering around across Russian lands, Russia was being ruled by Tsar Nicholas Romanov II. Nicholas's father, the previous Tsar, died in 1894. His death was sudden. At the time, Nicholas was only 26 years old, so he wasn't fully prepared to succeed his father and take over the rule. But his father's sudden death forced him to take the throne. The Romanov family had been ruling Russia for 300 years, so Nicholas inherited from his father the Russian Empire, which was at the peak of its expansion at that time. He inherited the wealth, the lavish palaces, the gold and diamond mines, and of course, he inherited absolute power and authority over Russia. At the beginning of his rule, he was under the shadow of his uncle Sergei, who was to a large extent able to control him and direct all his moves, especially since Nicholas was, still a young man with no experience in political matters and running a country. So Uncle Sergei had a huge influence on him. He was married to Princess Alexandra Fyodorovna, who was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. Back then, many nobles from European countries would marry each other. You'd find a German prince married to an English princess, a Russian prince married to a German princess, and so on. There was a lot of intermingling, and most of these were political marriages aimed at strengthening interests between these nations. But unlike the typical marriages in this class, Nicholas and Alexandra's marriage wasn't a political marriage. Their marriage was based on love. The first time they met was at the wedding of Nicholas's uncle, the one we just mentioned. This uncle married Alexandra's sister. At that time, Nicholas was 16 and Alexandra was 12, teenagers. They fell in love at first sight, their very first meeting at this wedding, and that love continued with them. When Nicholas grew older, he openly expressed his desire to marry Alexandra. His uncle and his uncle's wife were the first to support this decision, and they did get married in that year. So now he and his uncle were married into the same family, married to two sisters, and this connection made them even closer to each other. She considered herself a very religious woman who loved men of the clergy, and this was one of the main reasons she was drawn to him, because he shared that same side with her. So keep this in mind, because it'll be important later when their story intersects with Rasputin's story. Anyway, shortly after their marriage, in the same year, the Tsar, Nicholas's father, died, and Nicholas became the Tsar, and his wife Alexandra became the Tsarina. After a while, the time came for the official coronation ceremony, and a major event like this required huge celebrations, so a public feast was announced for all the people in a large square, one of the squares they used for military training. The person responsible for organizing this feast was Nicholas's uncle, Sergei. Some advisors in the palace were worried about this feast, and kept telling the Tsar that they needed to increase the number of soldiers and police who would manage the crowds during the event. But his uncle said, no, that's not necessary, I've assigned enough people, and he kept insisting on this. Sure enough, the day of the coronation came, and a massive rush of common people and peasants began, all coming to attend the promised feast. Sergei was expecting 200 to 300,000 people, but the number who showed up was closer to 1 million. The scene was insane. Look at this shot, for example. The number was unbelievable, and the problem was that the square where they held the feast, like we said, was a military training ground, so the terrain was dug up, rough, and severely damaged. It wasn't flat ground that people could easily walk on. They'd put some weak wooden boards down to try to level the ground a bit. But with this enormous crowding, disaster struck. The crowd started pushing, and many people in the middle of it all started suffocating and falling. A terrifying number of victims fell that day because of the severe stampede that happened. In historical photos of the scene, you can see wide areas completely filled with victims and people's bodies. I obviously can't show you these photos because YouTube would give us trouble over them, but you can imagine the scale of the tragedy that happened with the huge number of people present. News of the stampede and this disaster reached the Tsar. The first thing he did was go to his uncle who was responsible for the organization and asked him how many died. His uncle replied, "We haven't confirmed the number yet." He asked, "How many? Like 100 more?" His uncle replied, "Unfortunately, I'm afraid we're not talking in the hundreds. We're talking in the thousands." At this point, Nicholas was shocked and immediately said, "All right, we need to stop the celebrations." His uncle said, "No, I don't advise that. At the very least, we need to downplay the tragedy." He told his uncle, "No, it won't be a tragedy unless we make it one." Nicholas was easily influenced by his uncle's words. He was his closest advisor, and imagine, he managed to convince him to ignore the deaths of thousands of people on his coronation day. So they continued the celebrations as normal. The victims' bodies were piled up in carts and hauled to the side. Nicholas and his wife came out and greeted people from their procession as if nothing had happened. He followed his uncle's advice, and when they finished the public procession, they continued their celebrations inside the palace as normal, like nothing happened. Dancing, eating, and drinking. So from that day on, a new nickname started spreading for the Tsar, the nickname Nicholas the Bloody. Nobody was openly using this nickname, of course, but among themselves, people were using it, especially people who hated the Tsar. So this was the worst possible start a ruler could have with his people, and it started to signal ominous things coming for the country. But anyway, time passed, and roughly 10 years went by since Nicholas took the reins of power in Russia. During these years, he and his wife had 4 children, but they were all girls: Tatiana, Maria, Olga, and Anastasia. This was obviously frustrating for them because they wanted an heir to the throne, and the heir had to be a boy. All those years they kept trying, but always got a girl. But finally, after a long wait, their wish came true in 1904. That year, they finally got a male child, and they named him Alexei. And of course, Prince Alexei automatically became the heir to the Russian Empire's throne. But Prince Alexei had a big problem. He was sick with hemophilia, or what's called in Arabic, halnar. This is a rare hereditary disease. A person with this disease, if they get any wound, even a small one, will keep bleeding non-stop because their blood doesn't clot. So any normal person without the disease gets a wound, bleeds for a bit, and then the blood starts clotting and the wound heals. But those with hemophilia, their blood doesn't clot, so their wounds don't heal. And this later causes them severe complications, and most of them die at a young age. Nicholas and Alexander knew this disease well because it was present in their family. Now around this time, Russia got into trouble. Japan and Russia clashed. Russia looked at Japan and thought they were an easy target. But at that time, in 1904, Japan was a rising power in the world. The whole world at that time was experiencing the Industrial Revolution, but Japan in particular was advancing at incredible speed and was building themselves a terrifying arsenal of military weapons. The Russian Empire's biggest strength at the time was its naval fleet, so the Tsar directed his naval commanders to attack the Japanese fleet. The Russian fleet was stunned by a devastating Japanese force. They destroyed 3 warships, some of the biggest and most powerful battleships in the Russian fleet. And imagine, the person who was pushing the Tsar most toward this losing war was his uncle. He's the one who kept saying, "Let's fight them and occupy their country." He kept whispering in his ear until he declared war on them. So I mean, wow, everything this man touched turned into a disaster. Russia's clash with Japan was a failed one, and they pretty much lost every round of the war between them. So 1904 was one of the worst years for Nicholas. Failure in the war against Japan, and being blessed with a son who suffered from a serious disease. Of course, the second matter was the worst one. He'd been waiting 10 years for an heir, and then his son is born with this disease. It was a catastrophe bigger than any other catastrophe. So all his focus and his wife Alexandra's focus was aimed at their son Alexei. And imagine, he left the war management to his uncle Sergei. During this period, Rasputin was continuing his pilgrimage journey. And like we said, his reputation preceded him. He'd been traveling for several years, moving from city to city, still playing the role of the blessed monk who heals people. And at the same time, he was drinking, getting drunk, and being immoral. And since he now had high social status among people, this made it easier for him to get his hands on any woman he wanted. On the contrary, he would market himself to these women that he'd heal them with his blessings when they let him do whatever he wanted with them, and they'd believe him. Most of his followers, by the way, were women who were deceived by him. Honestly, what a strange case. Look at his face. Where does the blessing even come from with someone who looks like that? Like a scarecrow that appears in your nightmares. And on top of that, he reportedly didn't bathe or clean himself. This was part of the monastic rituals he'd adopted, so he stank unbearably. Despite all this, his affairs were going well, and everything was fine, and everyone believed he was blessed. And if this proves anything, it proves that this person, Rasputin, was smart. He had the intelligence and cunning of con artists. He knew how to deceive people and trick them into whatever he wanted. So during this pilgrimage, or more accurately this debauchery journey, Rasputin reached the city of St. Petersburg, which was Russia's capital at the time. There, Rasputin met the priest of the biggest church in the country. A priest close to the ruling family held considerable sway behind the scenes. Of course, this priest welcomed Rasputin. All the clergymen and church bishops had heard about him and his blessings and his spiritual ability to heal people. And people started coming to him, even from the noble class, wanting to see this miracle man whose name had spread across all of Russia. And Rasputin would perform his rituals on them and interact with them, making them feel like he was treating them. And like we said, he was actually manipulating the psychological aspect. Many of his advice and directions were actually very humane and gave people a sense of calm and tranquility. People would feel better immediately. He knew exactly what to tell them to ease their suffering. During this same time, the Tsar and his wife Alexandra were at the peak of their stress and anxiety because of their son Alexei's condition, which kept getting worse and worse, and also because they put on themselves the burden of hiding his condition from the public. It would have been easier for them if they'd announced his condition, but they didn't want people to see the heir to the throne as a weak person who could die at any moment. This was what was happening inside the palace walls, but outside the walls, things were also getting worse. Russia was losing its battles and wars on multiple fronts, and because of this, the Russian people inside the country were suffering from food shortages and supply problems, and life's difficulties were increasing. So this started leading to demonstrations, and people started gathering and riling each other up to demand changes in the country. And at that point, some revolutionary parties started appearing whose approach was more extreme. They wanted to topple the Tsar himself, and the Tsar wasn't aware of how bad the situation really was. None of his advisors, led by his uncle, were giving him the true picture of what was happening in his country. So he wasn't too worried about the popular movements taking place. He thought they were just, a bit of commotion that would pass. But imagine, crowds of people and massive demonstrations started marching toward the palace. These people weren't calling for the overthrow of the Tsar. On the contrary, they were chanting, "God protect the Tsar." The goal of the demonstrations was to demand reforms because the government was failing and the people were suffering. So they were demanding at least a people's council, like a parliament that would have a hand in the country's decisions. But these demonstrations were crushed with extreme violence. By orders from the Tsar, the army and soldiers were gathered to prevent the demonstrators from getting near the palace. They'd drawn a line on the ground and warned the demonstrators that they were forbidden from crossing it. But the demonstrators didn't care and crossed it, and from there, a massacre began. The soldiers started shooting at people in the street, and victims fell by the thousands. And yet, these were the very people who, moments before, had been chanting the Tsar's name and coming to him as their savior. So this was a crucial turning point in Russian history. Many people after this massacre completely lost hope in their ruler and started joining the revolutionary parties that had been calling from the beginning for the overthrow of the Tsar and his system. What began as idealism soon turned to violence, so many of these revolutionaries started carrying out bombings and armed operations. Even Sergei himself, the Tsar's uncle, was out in his carriage when a person walked beside the carriage and threw a bomb inside it. There was an explosion, and in one moment the carriage and Sergei with it turned to rubble. Many of the common people were happy when they heard the news. But in the palace, Nicholas was in a state of great shock, and he finally started to comprehend the extent of what was happening in his country. But these weren't just ordinary protests. The people were revolting and rebelling. And what made things even worse was that at the same time, the situation in the Eastern War with Japan was deteriorating from bad to worse. Imagine that Nicholas had to summon the main Russian fleet, the Baltic Sea Fleet. The Baltic Sea is located in this area in western Russia. So imagine this fleet traveled all that distance around the world, around Africa and Asia, from west to east to face the Japanese fleet. And in the end, After this epic journey, the Japanese fleet defeated them in just 40 minutes. It was a tragedy. It was a catastrophe in every sense of the word. Imagine you bring your main fleet, have it sail around the world, and leave important strategic locations in Europe unprotected, only to be defeated in 40 minutes. This defeat intensified the protests and revolution happening inside Russia even more. So at this point, the Tsar's advisor suggested that the situation needed some reforms and concessions, and that the situation called for establishing an elected People's Council to participate in making the country's decisions, so the people would feel they had a hand in power, like a council, a parliament, or a consultative council. His uncle Nicholas was completely against this idea, but Nicholas's uncle was dead now, and sure enough, in 1905, this council was established, called the Duma. This council was basically just for show, just to calm the people down. The decisions and absolute power still remained entirely in the Tsar's hands, but just his acceptance of establishing such a council was an achievement in itself. So the people calmed down a bit, waiting for the reforms that were supposedly coming. During this same period, an incident happened with Prince Alexei. He was out with his mother and servants in the palace garden, and while he was playing and running, he fell and wounded his leg, even though the wound wasn't that bad. Because of his disease, the blood kept flowing and flowing. His health deteriorated, and he fell sick in bed. His father and mother brought him the best doctors in the city. The doctors had no solution other than easing his pain with painkillers, but the little prince's condition kept getting worse, and his mother Alexandra's stress and psychological state became really bad as his condition worsened. She was almost reaching the point of a breakdown. At this crucial point in their lives, the Tsar and Tsarina heard from people close to them, from the noble class, that there was a blessed monk who treated and healed people named Rasputin. He was brought to the palace by summons from Tsar Nicholas and Alexandra. The moment Rasputin walked in on them, Alexandra felt a very strong presence and aura, like a blessed person descended from heaven. This was the impression Rasputin always tried to leave when he entered any new place. He had a skill for this, and always succeeded at it. He'd make everyone around him truly believe he was a great, blessed human being. And before the Tsar or his wife could say anything, Rasputin told them, "I know why you summoned me." The Tsar asked, "Why?" Rasputin said, "I know you want me to heal the little prince." Nicholas and Alexandra were stunned. How did he know? The matter was supposed to be secret. Rasputin continued and told them, "Last night I had a vision from God. I saw the little prince suffering and that he would die without me. My destiny and his destiny are intertwined." Of course, Rasputin most likely got the information leaked to him from one of the nobles who knew about the prince's illness. But when Nicholas and Alexandra heard his words, they became almost convinced that this was truly a blessed man. All that was left was for him to prove he could heal their son. They were religious people who loved clergymen, especially Alexandra, who also deeply believed in spiritual power and such things. So Rasputin entered Prince Alexei's room and approached the bed. Then he placed his hand on the prince's head and began his rituals and started murmuring. The amazing thing is that over the following days, Prince Alexei's condition improved significantly. Now you're going to say, wait, this is a disease, not a psychological condition. How could Rasputin treat it? Look, the explanation for what happened has two keys. The first key was the prince's mother, Alexandra. She was the most stressed and worried person about his condition and was in a terrible psychological state all the time. Like I told you, she was on the verge of a breakdown. So when Rasputin started reassuring the mother and calming her down, Alexei naturally calmed down too. At the very least, his condition wouldn't worsen. So the mother was a fundamental key in the treatment. But the second key, and the more important one, was that Rasputin stopped the doctor's treatments. He stopped the medications they'd been giving him. For pain and fatigue, the doctors were giving him aspirin. And aspirin is normally a painkiller that helps reduce pain. But in modern times, we've discovered that it's very bad for hemophilia patients because it reduces blood clotting even more, making the condition worse instead of improving it. So when Rasputin prevented the doctors and their medications, Alexei's condition improved. The whole thing was neither blessings nor magic nor anything else. It was just a coincidence because Rasputin didn't know that this particular medication, aspirin, was harmful to Alexei's condition. He just banned medications because he didn't believe in them. So it was like this strange thing how everything worked out for him in this way. And from this moment on, Rasputin became very close to the Tsar and Tsarina, especially Alexandra, who started seeing him like an angel of mercy descended from heaven. She literally revered him, and she started listening to him even in matters that had nothing to do with her son. And Tsar Nicholas himself started valuing Rasputin and gave him a high status. The situation stayed like this for a while. He'd basically become, in a way, part of the ruling family. He was with them all the time, coming and going with them. And any councils or meetings the Tsar attended, Rasputin would be with him, giving the Tsar his advice and opinions. He basically became like an advisor among the Tsar's advisors. So the Tsar's old advisors and people close to him were puzzled. Where did this Rasputin suddenly come from? How did his status become this high with the Tsar this quickly? Most of them didn't know about the little prince's illness, so they didn't know where this closeness between Rasputin and the ruling family began. This left resentment toward Rasputin in their hearts. Regardless, Rasputin became an established reality, and every day his influence and power over the Tsar and Tsarina grew. And during that time, the demonstrations increased again, and the people started revolting once more because they discovered that the Duma Council the Tsar had established was just for appearances, and that all decisions were still in his hands, and nothing was improving in the country. So the situation was chaos upon chaos. Demonstrations erupted everywhere. The army killed people in the streets, executions numbered in the hundreds, and across all of Russia, acts of sabotage, bombings, and massive destruction became the new reality. The prime minister at that time was a man named Pyotr Stolypin, and this man was trying with all his effort to push for reform and solve the problems. But despite this, imagine the revolutionaries blew up his house. They entered his house suddenly and threw bags containing bombs and ran away quickly. Seconds later, the explosion destroyed most of the house. Prime Minister Stolypin miraculously survived this explosion, but many of the guards and people who were in the house died, and his daughter was severely injured. Despite all this, he still kept trying to make reforms in the country. He didn't turn on the people, but there was a big problem he was facing from inside the palace itself. The Tsar wasn't listening. Rasputin's status with the royal family had become higher than anyone else's. The Tsar, and especially Alexandra, had become dependent on him more than any other person in existence. She depended on him even more than she did on her own husband, because he was the only person who could calm her down and reassure her. And of course, throughout all of this, Rasputin still hadn't abandoned his immorality or his deviant ways. Most of his followers and his audience were still women. He'd get close to them, deceive them, and keep saying sweet words until he got what he wanted from them. We're talking about women even from noble families who had husbands and children. Yet despite this, they'd line up in front of Rasputin, enchanted by him. Honestly, something truly strange. And there was even a lot of talk and rumor saying that Rasputin had gotten to the Tsarina herself, although this was never confirmed. These rumors were used systematically to tarnish the image of the Tsar, the royal family, and Rasputin along with them. There were drawings and pamphlets being printed and distributed among the people, showing Rasputin and the Tsarina in inappropriate situations. This was one of the methods the people used to attack the Tsar during the demonstrations and the unrest. So a lot of the hatred and anger was directed at Rasputin. People were baffled. Who is this peasant villager who's now manipulating the ruling family and the entire country? And from here, Rasputin's character became historically famous. Everyone's attention was focused on him, and as a result, his haters grew every single day. The support came from everywhere, from the royal family's relatives and the noble class, from the clergy, and even from the general public. There was a unified hatred across Russia against Rasputin. Even the Duma, the People's Council, started attacking the Tsar through their attacks on Rasputin, because they obviously couldn't attack the Tsar directly. Despite all this, the Tsar and Tsarina's relationship with Rasputin never weakened. On the contrary, it only got stronger. They were enchanted by him with an unwavering faith that this was a blessed man sent to them by God. With Rasputin's enemies increasing, it was only a matter of time before one of them made a move and tried to hurt or kill him. One day, while Rasputin was walking in one of the fields, he was surprised by a woman who looked like a beggar. She started asking him to help her. He reached into his pocket to pull out some money for her, and suddenly this woman pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the stomach. Even though the stab was deep, Rasputin managed to recover from it after spending just a few days on his sickbed. And this woman, they later discovered, was actually sent by some clergymen, priests who initially had a good relationship with Rasputin, but then that relationship turned to hatred and grudge. From this point, Rasputin started fearing for his life and became more wary of the people around him. Then came 1914, and at that time, World War I was at the doorstep. Rasputin, despite encouraging the Tsar to suppress demonstrations and crush the people, was actually against the war and kept urging the Tsar not to enter it. The start of World War I was because of a conflict between Serbia and Austria. Serbia was allied with Russia, but Austria on the other side was also allied with Germany, the greatest military power in the world at the time. So Russia entering the war meant direct confrontation with Germany. Rasputin advised the Tsar not to get involved in this war and kept saying that this war would be a losing one and could bring about the end of the Russian Empire. But the strange thing is that the Tsar this time didn't listen to his advice. Maybe he couldn't even afford to listen, because Serbia was like family to them, almost like part of Russian land. So how could the Tsar of Russia allow a country like Austria to invade and occupy Serbia? So Russia entered the war, which caused Germany to also enter the war, and World War I began. And Rasputin's prophecy came true immediately. The German army had a superior arsenal, and soldiers trained at the highest level. The Russian forces, made up mostly of peasants and ordinary people, stood no chance against them. Russia kept retreating and losing lots of territory to the German forces. This war issue didn't need a prophecy from Rasputin for anyone to see that Russia wasn't prepared for a war like this, especially after its defeat and its fleet's defeat against Japan. But regardless, when the defeat came, the Tsar started feeling Rasputin's value once again and thinking that if he'd listened to his advice, things could have been better. At this point, Rasputin gave the Tsar another piece of advice, that he should go himself and lead his soldiers on the front lines, meaning he should be at the head of the army instead of sitting in the palace. And the Tsar actually this time listened to Rasputin's advice and decided to go and lead the army himself. Many people immediately knew that Rasputin actually wanted to keep power for himself. If the Tsar wasn't in the capital, then the final word would go to his wife, the Tsarina, and the Tsarina was literally a puppet in Rasputin's hands. So we could say that during that period, Rasputin was practically the ruler of Russia. We've reached 1916. About 2 years had passed since the start of the war. During these 2 years, public anger against the Tsar and the ruling family reached its maximum levels, especially with the defeats the Russian army was witnessing on all war fronts. And actually, the Tsar's leadership of the army was one of the worst things that happened because the Tsar had no military experience whatsoever. His leadership made things worse. Meanwhile, in the capital, the level of tension was increasing day by day, and all of Russia, across all its classes, was against Rasputin. Rasputin during that time felt that his death could come at any moment at the hands of anyone. He was particularly worried about the Tsar's relatives and the nobles who were resentful of him because he was controlling the Tsarina and therefore controlling the entire country. So Rasputin wrote a letter to the Tsar and told him, "A catastrophe and disaster is approaching. The day of reckoning will come for our country and we will all drown in our own blood. I feel the end approaching. If I die at the hands of one of your relatives, one of the nobles, then this will be the end of Russia as we know it today, and it will also be the end of your family and your rule. None of you will survive." Rasputin sent this letter to the Tsar because he wanted to convey the sensitivity of the matter. He wanted to tell him, "Control your relatives, warn them, and let them know that nobody is allowed to come near me." But the Tsar at that time was far away on the Western Front and was preoccupied with the defeats his army tasted every day. So the last thing on his mind was thinking about Rasputin and his relationships with relatives, nobles, and people in the palace. He didn't give much attention to this letter. Anyway, time passed, and one day, one of the Tsar's relatives contacted Rasputin. This relative of the Tsar was a young man named Felix Yusupov, a prince from a very wealthy family in Russia, and he was actually married to the Tsar's niece, so he was related to them by marriage. This Felix was disgusted by Rasputin and harbored deep resentment toward him. He hated how the Tsarina had become a puppet in his hands, and hated the rumors spreading among people that the Tsarina had fallen in love with him and was infatuated. He saw him as a stain of shame on the ruling family. So one day he called Rasputin, introduced himself, and said he'd like to schedule a meeting with him because his wife had a personal health issue and they wanted Rasputin to visit their home so they could show him, and they needed his help. He said he hoped Rasputin could honor them with a visit to their house the next evening. Even though Rasputin felt a bit uneasy, it would have been strange for him to refuse an invitation from a nobleman like Felix. Felix's wife was the Tsar's niece, and besides, it wasn't unusual for nobles to request his healing assistance. So Rasputin replied to Felix and said, "All right, fine. Tomorrow evening I'll be at your place and I'll see your wife's issue and treat her." The next day, Prince Felix and his accomplices started preparing the drinks and food to receive Rasputin. But these drinks and food had been laced with potassium cyanide poison mixed into the cakes and beverages. Felix wanted to kill him. That evening, Rasputin arrived at the palace. Felix took him alone to one of the rooms where they prepared the food. He invited him to sit down and said, "Make yourself comfortable, eat whatever you want." And then he started pouring him drinks. They'd literally put poison in everything on the table except one type of drink they knew Rasputin didn't prefer. They didn't put poison in that one so Felix could drink with him without making things seem suspicious. The incredible thing is that Rasputin kept drinking and no effect from the poison showed on him at all. This potassium cyanide was supposed to kill him immediately, but he kept drinking and eating the cake as if nothing was wrong, taking it easy, completely relaxed. Felix sat there stunned, wondering how he was still alive. Not even a single sign of poisoning had appeared on him. Felix excused himself from Rasputin and went out to his accomplices who were waiting for him outside the room and told them, completely bewildered, that Rasputin is sitting there eating and drinking and nothing has happened to him. The group was shocked. How was this even possible? At this point they said, "All right, you have to kill him yourself." So Felix took a gun and went back to the room. The moment Rasputin turned his head, he was startled by Felix aiming a gun at him. Felix fired a bullet into Rasputin's chest, and Rasputin fell to the ground. Right after they heard the shot, Felix's accomplices and the nobles with him rushed in and saw him. When they got close, suddenly Rasputin woke up, grabbed Felix by the neck, caught him off guard and threw him to the side. Then he got up and started running. He ran through the corridors of the palace and reached the door, and then started staggering in the outer courtyard, swaying from his injury. Felix and the others kept chasing him and shooting at him until he reached the outer gates, which were locked. There, they shot him again. And even after he fell this time, they kept shooting at him until they were sure he was dead. Then they took his body, carried it away, and threw it in the river. And that was the end of Rasputin. When they found his body in the frozen river the next morning, most people in Russia received the news with joy. But the royal family, specifically the Tsar and Tsarina, fell into a state of deep grief and mourning. After that, the Tsar decided to return once again to the command center on the Western Front to lead the war. But this was the worst possible time to leave the capital, because the protests and acts of unrest had reached their peak. And this revolution was now being led by extreme parties. Chief among them the people called the Bolsheviks, who were led by Vladimir Lenin, who would later become the founder of the Soviet Union after the Romanov family fell. So yeah, the fall was imminent, just like Rasputin predicted in his letter to the Tsar. The demonstrations literally didn't stop, and when the protesters started surrounding the palace where the Tsar's family still was, the Tsarina herself sent orders to the soldiers to start dispersing the people by force. So victims started falling in horrific numbers, and a massacre took place in front of the palace. Despite the massacre and the victims, the people didn't back down. They kept pushing toward the palace and started pushing against the gates. Meanwhile, on the battlefronts, the Russian soldiers, many of whom were peasants and ordinary people, started disobeying their commanders. Instead of pointing their weapons at their enemies, they pointed them at their commanders and declared their disobedience to military orders. And from here, defections by the thousands started spreading through the ranks of the Russian army. Many soldiers were leaving the front lines and going back inside Russia to join their families in the protests, especially in the capital. And these defecting soldiers, what did they have with them? They had weapons. So for the first time in the history of Russian protests, the scales started tipping. For the first time, this number of armed revolutionaries were present in the streets of the capital, and this was something the palace guards hadn't accounted for. The soldiers and the army itself had joined the revolution, so at this point it was clear that this was the end of the royal family. The Tsar immediately, as soon as the news reached him, moved his train and headed back to the capital once again. The Tsar's advisors during those final moments told him to abdicate the throne because things were now under the revolutionaries' control. All he could do was try to save himself and save his family. He had to give up the throne. And sure enough, the Tsar announced his abdication of the throne through an urgent telegram to the Duma, the People's Council, and declared his stepping down from the throne. The revolutionary forces at that time had seized the palace, of course, and there were soldiers loyal to the revolution standing at the palace gates. The Tsar's family, nobody harmed them, but they were held inside the palace. So when the Tsar arrived at the palace, the scene was very painful for him. The soldiers there treated him in a humiliating and degrading manner, as if he hadn't been their ruler just 2 days days ago. But the important thing was that Nicholas reunited with his family once again. Power in Russia now had two claimants. On one side stood the Duma, the People's Council. On the other, the Revolutionary Soviet Council. But between these two councils, there were members who could bridge the gap. One of these members was a man named Alexander Kerensky. So Alexander Kerensky was tasked with forming a provisional government and leading it. And Kerensky himself said he could guarantee the Tsar's safety and the safety of his family, and that the provisional government would protect them. Yet Kerensky himself was one of the earliest revolutionaries to demand the Tsar's removal. But in the end, his goal wasn't to kill them. Most likely, the Tsar and his family would remain in custody for a while, and then either they'd be exiled to another country or kept in a known location permanently. But unfortunately, Kerensky's provisional government, which guaranteed the Tsar's protection, didn't last. Due to the country's unstable conditions, Kerensky was overthrown, and his provisional government was toppled within just 3 months. The revolutionaries and the Bolshevik Party, specifically, led by Vladimir Lenin, carried out a military coup and seized power. And imagine, this man had spent 20 years of his life calling for the overthrow of the royal family through violence, and he always even called for the execution of the Tsar. So now the royal family's fate was in their hands. May 1918, Lenin, after gaining complete control of power, issued an order to one of the secret police units to carry out a special mission. For this mission, a unit of hand-picked soldiers was assembled. Soldiers completely loyal to the cause. This unit was ordered to transfer the royal family to one of the secret houses. They gathered the former Tsar's family in this house, which was basically like a prison. Even the windows of the house all had bars on them, but the family was still optimistic. They believed they would most likely be exiled and sent to another country secretly. But what they didn't know was that the Bolsheviks' grudge against them was far too great for them to let them slip from their grip easily. These people had been resentful toward them for many long years. Their own leader wanted to execute the Tsar, but he didn't want to do it publicly. He didn't want to cause a commotion. And that was the purpose of this secret house where they imprisoned them. This house was in an area entirely controlled by the fanatical Bolsheviks. All the people and all the soldiers there had the Bolshevik ideology deeply rooted in them. They all wanted to see this royal family die and disappear. They wanted their lineage to go extinct. 2 months after the Tsar's family was detained in this house, when they were sure everything was ready, soldiers entered their room one night and told them, "We need you dressed and ready as fast as possible." Nicholas and his family were confused, asking what's happening, what's going on. They were told they were going to be secretly transferred to England. They were half expecting this, so they complied. The soldiers escorted them and took them down to an underground corridor, like a basement. And the Tsar's family, imagine, they thought they were being smuggled underground. Then they were brought into one of the rooms and told, "Sit here for a while and wait." They locked the door on them. Nicholas and his family waited in this room for a while. Then the soldiers came back again, and their commander pulled out a piece of paper and read what was on it. By order of the Revolutionary Command, the former Tsar Nicholas and his family have been sentenced to death. The sentence is to be carried out immediately, and suddenly the soldiers drew their pistols and opened fire on the entire family, his wife, their children. They executed all of them by gunfire. A crazy historical scene. They killed everyone, and it's even said that their dog was with them and some of their servants too. And you know what's even worse? Even after they fired an insane amount of bullets at them, many of them were still alive. Especially the daughters. They didn't die. They were wounded and screaming, but they didn't die. How? Because they'd sewn jewels inside their clothing. Nicholas and his family had been expecting they'd be exiled to another country, so they took their jewelry and sewed it inside their clothes so nobody would confiscate it from them. So when this massacre happened and the soldiers opened fire on them, the jewels acted almost like a bulletproof vest. But at the same time, that didn't completely stop the bullets. The bullets would hit them and wound them, but wouldn't kill them. So imagine, besides being a massacre, it was an extremely painful killing process. The soldiers kept shooting and shooting, but in the end, some of them were still alive. Some of the daughters were still alive and clearly moaning, so the soldiers had to go to them and finish them off with knives. It was a massacre, one of the most horrific imaginable. And of course, this operation, the instructions said it had to remain secret and not be announced. So they took the bodies, burned them, and dissolved them in acid so no trace would remain. But there were still remains, so they took them and buried them in a remote location. And this was the end of the last royal family that ruled Russia. and after them the Soviet Union was established by Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. These historical stories really make you reflect. I mean, imagine if, for example, the Tsar hadn't met Rasputin, or if he'd had a better advisor than his uncle Sergei. Imagine how much that alone could have changed all of Russian history. But in the end, these are God's decrees, and God's decree can never be changed. But these events really make you think and reflect, and here we've reached the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, goodbye and good night.